So I think now might be a good time to begin. So hello and welcome to our series on racism, discrimination, and othering, perspectives from around the world. I'm Dr. Maria Nardone, Director of Technology and Global Learning at the William Allenson White Institute of Psychoanalysis, Psychiatry, and Psychology in New York City. Before I introduce our guest speakers this morning, I would like to thank members of the Institute's administration who have made our series possible: Dr. Elizabeth Krimendahl, Mr. Richard Herman, John Aumann, and Elizabeth Rodman. Thank you. I am also very grateful for the work of the members of my committee. They have created our program, invited our speakers, and will be the moderators for our events. Our members are Max Belkin, Karen Gennaro, Anton Hart, Tom Hennis, Gurmeet Kanwal, Catherine Nordzi, Vladin Novogovich, Jean Petrucelli, Hopeton Shaw, David Solomon, Masato Tsujikawa, and Cleone White. To all of you, thank you. Welcome also our participants from around the globe. As mentioned, we have many people from Greece with us here this morning, from Russia, Mexico, South Africa, a large number from South Africa, Japan, Germany, Belarus, Poland, Ukraine, Israel, Vietnam, Romania, and of course, many people from the United States. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions for our speakers today. We will try to address as many as possible. Also, during our meeting, you may add questions today using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Our guest today is Masha Yaglom, and our moderator is Dr. Max Belkin. Masha Yaglom is an interpersonal psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. She is a supervisor and teacher of psychoanalysis and is affiliated with the Manhattan Institute of Psychoanalysis, the Institute of Contemporary Psychotherapy, and with Machanayim Jewish Heritage Center. Masha Yaglom came to the US as a refugee from the former Soviet Union in 1988. Back in the USSR, she was trained as a clinical psychologist, was part of a political dissidence and refuseniks community, and participated in the Jewish Heritage Liberation Movement. Welcome, Masha. Our moderator is Dr. Max Belkin. Dr. Belkin is a fellow, supervisor of psychotherapy, and director of our online interpersonal psychoanalytic psychotherapy program for Russian speakers at the William Allenson White Institute. He is also adjunct instructor at New York University, associate editor of Contemporary Psychoanalysis, editor with Cleone White of Intersectionality and Relational Psychoanalysis, New Perspectives on Race, Gender, and Sexuality. He is a licensed clinical psychologist and psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. So without any more from me, I turn the program over to Masha and to Max.
Thank you very much, Maria, and thank you very much the committee for organizing this wonderful and I think very important conversations. And especially thank you, all of you, for joining us today, for making the time on Sunday to talk about things that are sad, that are challenging, that I think stir up all kinds of emotional responses in all of us. And it's unfortunate that I cannot see your faces, but I know that you're here, and I very much look forward to receiving questions from you. I know that some of this is controversial. I know that some people will disagree, and I hope that we will have a conversation. I hope we'll have a discussion, and I hope that we can also keep it civil. I've been thinking a lot about this series, and I'm glad that we're organizing them in general, but especially in this particular year that has been so challenging for people all over the world. A lot of it has to do, obviously, with the pandemic, but there have been so many other tragedies Just in the United States, we've had several pandemics. The pandemic of mass shootings and the police killings of African American and Latinos, and the rise in anti-Asian violence. And I think what makes it so difficult for so many people and families and communities that these traumas have been happening for way too long, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries. And when we are isolated, that's when the trauma often sets in, because we can't talk to each other, we can't see each other, we can't hang out. And we've seen a rise in mental illness, especially anxiety and depression in this country, and not just among our patients, but among the public at large. So I think it's very important for us, for the global community, to come together and feel each other's presence and try to empathize with each other. And when I posted some information about this talk on social media, I received a couple of emails from my esteemed Russian colleagues to express their indignation that we were doing this in the first place. They thought that as Americans, we should be talking about anti-Black racism in the United States and leave the Soviet Union alone. And when I shared with them some of my own experiences and the experiences of my grandparents and my parents in the former Soviet Union, I hit a wall. The response was, we loved our country, you immigrated, there was no anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union, and we don't understand what you're talking about. And one of them also mentioned that it's normal for people to be envious of rich people, and since Jews are rich, it makes sense that people all over the world would be envious of Jews. So when I read all of this, it made me very upset and very angry, and I really wanted to talk to someone about this. And Masha, I couldn't really think of a better person to talk about this with, because I have enormous respect for you as my colleague, and also very much appreciate you as a friend. So I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. But then something else happened this week. I gave a talk to a group of Russian psychologists in St. Petersburg. And there were 20 people. They were very enthusiastic and very engaged. And they were sitting in the same room. There was no social distancing. Nobody was wearing a mask. And they told me that in Russia, everything is open. Everybody goes to movie theaters and restaurants. And then I read in the New York Times last weekend that more than 400,000 people died in Russia of COVID. And it occurred to me that anti-Semitism is about Jews, but it's also about everybody else. When you lie, when you spread misinformation, it can become deadly, and it can become deadly for everyone. It's like cancer. It starts in one part of your body and then it spreads everywhere. So I hope that we also can talk about the profound impact that this kind of way of living in a society affected everyone and might still be affecting everyone. So these are kind of some of my thoughts for why I thought this conversation would be important. And Masha, I'm curious to hear from you. I know you've been preparing for this too. Why do you think we should still be talking about this?
Let me start from afar. I had a very strange week. I was dropping things down on the floor. I was forgetting about my appointments. I wasn't really myself. And I couldn't understand what was happening until I sat down and started thinking. And I realized that I was anxious about this talk. And it's not that I was simply anxious about it. I was petrified. Horrified probably should be an even better word. Because as I realized, I have never spoken about anti-Semitism in public. Yes, I did speak to my friends. Yes, I did speak to my colleagues. Yes, we spoke about anti-Semitism behind closed doors in the former Soviet Union. But speaking like this in public to people from all over the world has never happened to me. And I realized that I was overwhelmed by fear. And that fear was totally irrational, and it came from my past. It came from my past life in a country where telling the truth was forbidden. It was punished severely. People got incarcerated, people got killed. And I knew that. My body knew that. I remembered it somehow, unbeknownst to me. And all those memories started attacking me violently, I would say. But let's, no, one more thing. In 1965, Elie Wiesel, a famous writer and also a Holocaust survivor, who lost his family in Auschwitz and who lost his community, decided to go to the Soviet Union. He wanted to meet Jewish people in the Soviet Union because nobody heard anything about the Soviet Jews. They lived behind the Iron Curtain. And since it was already after Khrushchev denounced the cult of Stalin, he was able to get permission to come to the country. And even though he understood that there would be surveillance and it would be very difficult for him to meet Soviet Jews, he somehow managed to meet some. And he wrote a book which is called The Jews of Silence, because his observations came mostly from looking into people's eyes. And those eyes were filled with fear. People tried to approach him and to talk to him, but they would start talking and immediately would disappear because they were afraid of informants who were probably watching them. And the way he writes about those eyes is just so evocative. He says he left his eyes there. So what's the reason for that fear that Elie Wiesel felt? And what's the reason for the fear that I sensed and that overwhelmed me? Let's take a look at history. I'm not a historian, so I'll just mention certain events in history, in the history of the Soviet Union. And obviously, the history of anti-Semitism goes back to the Tsarist Russia, to the pogroms, to the ways in which Jews could live only within the pale. But interesting enough, within the pale, Jews were allowed to practice Judaism. They had their own synagogues, they had their own schools, they could bake matzah, they could observe holidays and Shabbat, and they could live. There were horrible times. Actually, Ellis Island Museum has a lot of footage, photographs of what happened during pogroms. But nevertheless, Jewish culture existed and even thrived in some places. When the October Revolution changed the lives of everyone in the Russian Empire, there was a sense of hope. The Bolsheviks declared that everyone would be equal and that there would be no restrictions and people could practice whatever they want to practice, and they should have their cultural heritage and they should be proud of their cultural heritage. And for a short while, it seemed that that's really what they were planning to implement. Very soon after the revolution, Lenin terror started, and then Stalin terror took over. It became clear that the country, the power that ruled the country, fought difference. Everyone who could think and was different was persecuted, or at least almost everyone. Intellectuals, artists, writers, priests, rabbis, a lot of people. According to Solzhenitsyn, 40 million people actually had been killed by Stalin's and Lenin's terror. Party functionaries one day were great and were glorified, and next day they were proclaimed to be enemy of the people and were persecuted as well. The machine of terror worked smoothly and tortured people endlessly. Black jeeps came at night to gather people, and during the day the country marched and glorified communism, up the glorious future that was supposed to come. Then the war started. I'm talking about the Second World War, and yes, there were a lot of actually Jews that were killed during the civil war that ensued right after the revolution. But that's another story. With the Second World War, the Holocaust came. What's interesting is that the Holocaust was never mentioned in the former Soviet Union. It was forbidden to talk about it. And even more so, it was forbidden to talk about the Jews that had been killed in the Nazi-occupied territories of the Soviet Union, because probably because they were also killed by the locals, by the local policies or by the volunteers. And the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., it has movies that were taken by the Nazis of local population doing away with the Jews. I myself learned about the fact that my great-grandparents perished in the Minsk ghetto only after their daughter, my grandmother, passed away. My family was afraid to tell their children about those events. It was dangerous to know. We lived in the country where knowledge was forbidden. And that's it's very important to consider the consequences of a ban on knowledge and on ban on truths are tremendous and horrendous. After the war, the policy of the government changed, and there started several campaigns that were really directed against the Jewish population. One campaign was called cosmopolitanism, and everybody knew that they meant Jews when they spoke about cosmopolitans who were supposedly interested in culture, in European culture, foreign philosophy, etc. And that meant that they gave permission to fire Jews and to not to hire them. A lot of people were without jobs. Then there came a campaign against the members of the Anti-Fascist Committee. During the war, Stalin organized an Anti-Fascist Committee, which was, there were Jewish writers that wrote in Yiddish primarily, and they were sent to go all over the world, basically to raise funds for the Soviet Union, to help the Soviet Union fight in the war. And they were telling everyone that Jews are not persecuted in Soviet Union, and Jews have a lot of hope in the Soviet Union, and raised a lot of funding. I remember that I once made a skirt for myself from a coat that was sent by the Americans to the Soviet Union as a result of that fundraising that the Anti-Fascist Committee did. After the war, all the members of the Anti-Fascist Committee were declared to be enemies of the people. They were obviously members of the Secret Service, of CIA, or God knows what. They were not simply killed. The trial lasted 1.5 years. They were tortured, beaten up. They were old, quite old. Some of them were brought into the courtroom on stretchers. They were eventually all executed. And then there was this big plan that the government started working on, deporting all the Jews into Azerbaijan, which is part of the far east part of Siberia, where the plan was that most of them would die in commute because they were supposed to go in cattle cars, and the rest would hopefully die off there. The plan was already there were cars, there were cattle cars prepared in Leningrad and in Moscow, but Stalin died, and that plan never went through. There was another plot right before Stalin's death, which is famous as a doctor's plot, which mentioned only Jewish doctors who were supposedly out to poison people, to poison Stalin and other party leaders. And that gave another permission to people to fire Jewish doctors. Actually, another relative of mine was a doctor, was a very good dentist in Smolensk, and people loved her, and she helped a lot of people, and she was fired from the clinic where she had worked. And people tried to see her in her house at home because they really needed a good doctor, but she wasn't allowed to practice. So in that atmosphere, Jews obviously became very fearful for their lives. When one person of one's family was persecuted, the rest of the family was persecuted as well. My grandmother was a member of Palestinian party before the revolution. She wanted to go to Palestine and build a socialist state there for the workers. When the revolution came, all the members of the Palestinian party were offered to become members of the Communist Party, which was called RSDRP at that time. And it wasn't that they had a choice. That wasn't really an offer. They had to join. Of all the members of her party, all of them except for her had been killed within 10 years. She was saved by the director of the institute where she had worked, who called her and said, "Masha, you have to disappear." She understood immediately. And then my mother, who was probably 12 at that time, heard her mother, my grandmother, approach her every evening and tell her, "If they come tonight and take me and daddy, take your younger sister," and depending upon the season, she would add, "Well, go to Ancile, and she has either money for winter coats or money for summer camps." This lasted until 1941. That saved my grandmother. The war started, and my grandmother was saved. But until now, even after 20 years of my own personal psychoanalysis, I still have nightmares that are reminiscent of what my mother went through and what my grandmother went through. I never went through such horrors, and they didn't even talk to me about them until I was much older, but the nightmares started much earlier, because this is how we pass our experiences on our relatives. This is what intergenerational trauma is about. And even though I worked on my nightmares and they do not control my life anymore, this week I was getting them again. So this is the atmosphere where we lived. If you don't, Max, would you like to proceed with some questions? So may I just continue? I just wanted to focus on the way anti-Semitism, how anti-Semitism was expressed and how it affected people's lives in their life cycle.
Please continue. This is exactly what I'm looking for.
Okay, so so I think that it would make sense for us to take a look at how it affected one person's life. Giving birth. I heard from many Jewish women who gave birth in Soviet Union that they hadn't been attended to when they were screaming. Eventually they had been attended to, but they oftentimes heard nurses and doctors say, she is Jewish, she knows how to experience pain, she knows how to be patient. Kindergarten. A lot of my patients had been severely traumatized in kindergarten. They had been abused as Jews. And I'm talking about highly functioning people who live with those traumas and who suffer, sometimes silently. Children would bully them. Sometimes the kindergarten instructors would bully them. The stories that I hear most of all is that nobody would marry you because you're a Jew. Nobody would want to play with you. Can you imagine how it affects a person's ability to relate and to build relationships? I wanted, when I was thinking about this presentation, I came across some notes, some memories they had written a while ago. And I just wanted to read one of those because it vividly depicts what children went through. The Berkshires are beautiful as always. We're renting a house on a lake in a very nice community. Every day when I take my little daughter to the beach, I want her to make friends with the children there. I also look for the most private spot where I could lie down with a book. My friend, who is also a mother, points it out to me. If you want your daughter to make friends, you have to go to a spot closer to where parents with children are. I can see her point, but when I start thinking, I realize that I virtually dread going there. Everybody is very friendly and welcoming, and I dread interacting with them. One memory stands out. I'm 10 years old, and I'm playing by myself in our neighborhood in a yard in Moscow. I see other children playing, and I want to join them, but I'm too shy. One of the boys approaches me with a smile. He asks me for my name and invites me to join them. I gladly do. The minute I join them, they start mocking me, shouting anti-Semitic slurs in my face. I'm trying not to show to them that it bothers me, and I retreat with a smile accompanied by their slurs. They follow me giggling and abusing me verbally. I am most of all hurting because I allowed myself to get trapped again, because I openly expressed joy when I accepted the boys' invitation to play with them, and they saw it, and how much they must have gloated about my disappointment. How could I be so beguiling, so naive? 40 years later, it still hurts. I don't want my daughter to be so naive, and simultaneously, of course, I want her to be able to trust and to accept invitation to play and to join other children. And yet, I make sure the spot where I lie down on the beach is the most private. This is how I pass my past on to her. I also pass it on to her by hating to ask directions, to ask for any information. This is about being an immigrant and dreading being discovered as an immigrant or as a Jew. Questions were not encouraged in the former Soviet Union. Too many questions, too much curiosity immediately revealed an outsider in you. Somebody who wanted to know rather than abstain from knowing and rely on the authorities who claimed to know it all and to take such good care of you. There was only one step from being an outsider to being a Jew. This is very important to note, that the former Soviet Union was a country of lies. Lies were perpetrated, and people had to live a lie. In order to become somebody, one had to know how to lie. Soviet Constitution is considered one of the most progressive in the world. But the country was ruled by, not by the Constitution. And everybody was supposed to say and to think one and the same thing. And to ask questions wasn't really encouraged. Learning and asking questions was considered almost a crime. People had been incarcerated for smiling, for a particular body language with which they could express their doubt. When I first came here, people asked me why I wasn't smiling. It took me a while to allow myself to smile in public. I see, Max, that you're smiling. You're probably recognizing something. In order to pass by, one had to know how to uphold a lie, not the truth. At one point, when my mother was already quite old, she told me that one of the worst trials in her motherhood, was that she had to teach her children how to lie in order to pass by. And I'm obviously talking about the ideology that we had to know by heart, that we had to take exams on, and we had to remember. Here is another, and yes, if we're talking about life cycle and how people were affected, one of the most horrible experiences that almost everyone remembers is the classroom journal. Classroom journal was read out, had contained names of the class of the students, and it also had their nationality. And there were teachers who would start a class with every lesson with reading out the journal and reading out the nationality. And when it came to the word Jew, a lot of students sneered or laughed. That was a horrible, horrible moment. Sometimes children would grab that journal themselves and would read it out loud. It was like as if you were found out to be a criminal. And nobody knew why it was bad to be a Jew, but a lot of people knew that it was bad. Here we're going back to the Tsarist Russia. Remember, I mentioned that Jews were allowed to practice their religion, that they had Jewish schools, etc. All those things disappeared after the war. There were no schools where there could be classes in Yiddish. There were no Jewish books. It was impossible for a long time to buy matzah, and there were trials, and people were persecuted because they baked matzah. It was impossible to find out what all this was about. What was it about being a Jew? My father was an intellectual, and he also had a very big library. As a matter of fact, a lot of his friends came to him to borrow books. Books were a rare commodity as well in Russia. It wasn't easy to buy them. But there were no books there that I could find that would explain what was wrong with being Jewish. I didn't know what was wrong with being Jewish. I knew that I wouldn't betray my family, but at the same time, I grew up embarrassed. Until in my 20s, I met some people who had been able to preserve some bits and pieces of Jewish tradition and shared their knowledge with me. But most people knew nothing. They were robbed of their cultural heritage, of experiences, of anything positive that forms a person's self-esteem. So on the one hand, one had to live with lies and at the same time try not to lie to oneself. That's quite tricky. Can you imagine how one does it? So either a person starts believing what's being taught about the fact that Soviet Union is the most advanced country in the world, while at the same time a person sees that there is no food in stores and there are no shoes available, or there is no water going from the faucet, or if there is absence of many things, then people disappear, but we are the best country in the world. And believe it or not, the propaganda was very powerful. When we're already immigrating, my in-laws put all their belongings into a very big wooden box, and we couldn't understand why they were doing it. And only when we came to the United States, they explained that they heard that everyone is homeless in the United States of America. But they wanted to immigrate with their children, and they decided they would live in that box. It was very difficult to find what was true. There was no truth in the Soviet newspapers. Foreign newspapers weren't available. You couldn't listen to a foreign radio, it was blocked. Only those people who managed to buy very powerful radiolas were able to sometimes listen to the news. My father used to joke that an intelligent person opens the Soviet newspaper and reads in it that in the country Anaconda, there was a coup and the left took over the country. And an intelligent person thinks, it must be not true. The right came to the power. But as a matter of fact, even the country does not exist. The degree of disinformation had been incredible. And how does one sort it out? How does one make friendships with the kind of people who do not belong to one's own very closed world? It's always scary. I deal with some patients who have been severely traumatized by their families, who used to tell me that the whole world around them was hostile, was out to get them. And so these people oftentimes try to overcome those fears and to pretend that they're not afraid, and they get themselves in trouble just because it's so difficult to integrate all of that trauma and to work it through. Then going again through the life cycle, when a person graduated high school and learned enough lies to either become a zombie or to create some kind of a withdrawn inner world behind an iron curtain, a person usually wanted to go to college. And there was a quota for Jews to enter colleges. There were colleges that did not accept Jews, and there were colleges that were very difficult to get into. Here is another excerpt that I wanted to read. I wanted to go to the Moscow University, to the Moscow School of Psychology. I knew that since I was Jewish, I had to study day and night in order to pass the exams. The exams were not multiple choice exams. They were much more difficult. There were several exams that were oral, and it was very easy to fail an applicant. And the written exams were even easier to fail because nobody was present when the group of people who were kind of, a part of them was from the party committee of the university when they were reviewing the papers, the essays. So here is my story. By then, I was not only Jewish, but I also was a daughter of political dissident. My father became a human rights activist, and there was a price to pay for that. He was fired from his professor's position at Moscow University. And here is the story. I will never forget that day. My mother hugged me when I was leaving to take my entry exam in history to the Moscow School of Psychology. I knew she was worried. The exam was supposed to be a tool to screen the untouchables out, the quote-unquote untouchables out. It was oral, and it was conducted not by the members of the school faculty, but by the faculty of the Moscow School of History that was notorious for its anti-Semitism and complete lack of liberalism. As I had found later, my name was on 2 blacklists, one for Jews, another for political dissidents. And my father was a dissident. For the whole year, I had a tutor who taught me how to pass. He also taught me a lot about Russian history, but his primary duty was to teach me how not to let them fail me. There were 20 applicants for each slot, and all the exams were very competitive. This one on ideology, though, the ideology that I hated by then. Yet, I was going to prove to them that I knew it. In the beginning, all the applicants were standing in the school's lobby and waited for their names to be called. Gradually, the group was becoming smaller and smaller, and all of a sudden I realized that unbeknownst to us, we had been divided into 2 groups, and the time of actual exam taking was different between 2 groups. There was just few applicants left from the quote-unquote fast group, and everyone who was still waiting to be called to the slow exam room looked Jewish. This is what I mean when I say that I will never forget that day. It is that dread that I felt when I realized what was going on. It is the fear that I detected in the eyes of other Jewish applicants. My parents never warned me about it. In general, it was understood that being a Jew could complicate my getting in the Moscow University. But since it was a fact of life, like change of seasons, it was not worth discussing it with me. I never mentioned to my parents what I went through waiting to be called into the exam room, but I did tell them in detail how the exam went. It turned out to be a huge success. The person who was supposed to fail me gave me the highest grade, and as I learned later, almost lost her chances of getting her PhD and defending her thesis. My tutor did a great job, and years later, while I'm writing this book, I find myself still struggling to free myself from what he had taught me. I am also struggling with shame admitting it. What is it? First of all, it was a skill of lying. Also, in order to win, I had to prove that I was one of them. Like my friend's mother, who had proved to the Nazis that she belonged to an Aryan race by having been blonde and having recited Christian prayers by heart. This is not, I was actually very happy. I thought I won. I thought I overcame them. And I was admitted into the School of Psychology. Years later, I found out why and how I was actually accepted. I didn't know the truth. During the years of the fighting of the cosmopolitanism, when Jews were fired from everywhere, my mother couldn't get a job. She finally got a job. She was a teacher of French language. She finally got a job in a school for delinquent boys who were orphaned because of the war. Nobody thought that she would be able to stay there, to last. But somehow she not only managed to stay there, but she also managed to make those boys love French. For years, she had been receiving letters from them thanking her. Amazingly, a lot of those boys became prominent Soviet citizens. One of them became a very prominent figure in the Moscow Academy of Science. He was a historian. Apparently, before I had to take my exam in history, my mother called him and said to him that she wanted to see him for 5 minutes. They made an appointment. She came in and she told him, my daughter is going to take exam in history. She wants to enter a school of psychology. She is Jewish. Could you please help her to get a fair treatment? He said, I'll try. When I passed the exam, my mother learned about it from him. He called her and he told her, your daughter deserved the highest grade. She got it. That was the true story about the way I got accepted into the Moscow School of Psychology. A lot of Jews were not as lucky as myself. They didn't have such ways, such means of getting into colleges. And eventually, well, there were actually several colleges in Moscow that were known for accepting Jews. But I also know I have some colleagues who are psychologists and who retrained here because there was no way that they could be accepted in the Moscow University during those years. And the ordeal wasn't over. When a person got accepted and went through years of college, person then had to get a job. Getting a job for a Jew was very difficult. I went on internship to an Institute of Culture, which we used to jokingly call an Institute of No Culture, since it was also about lies. I did a big research of foreign literature on sociology for the director of our lab there, of a division of that institute. And he promised that he would get me a job. Little did I know that he included my research into his doctoral dissertation. And he obviously didn't want to hire me. Well, my search for a job is a different story, but it was incredibly difficult for anyone. And at the same time, there were lies on lies and on lies. This is what's so incredible. I remember we had a professor, Bluma Zygarnik. She was a famous psychologist. There is a phenomenon, Zygarnik, in psychology. And she was an associate of Kurt Lewin before the October Revolution. And she was a professor in the Moscow School of Psychology, and she was my mentor. And when I was graduating, she asked me, I visited her in her home, and her grandchildren were playing somewhere around us. And she asked me, Masha, where are you going to work? And I told her, Bluma, I don't know. I am a Jew. It's very difficult to get a job. And she started whispering and telling me, hush, there are children around. You're not supposed to tell the truth. This is what's the most difficult thing. I know that we are probably running out of time, and there is another kind of line of questions that we needed to address. So my question to you, Max, shall I continue, or shall we talk a little bit about the Jewish resistance and how we all came to be here?
That seems very important. So I would love to hear about it. because
So
both persecution and the lack of support and the lack of community that would help each other survive. And you're talking about how these traumatic experiences were transmitted from one generation to another, from parents to children. And you mentioned in the beginning that sometimes we experience it like you experience in your own body, sometimes during the waking hours, sometimes in your sleep. And I know this is what my patients tell me about too. So since many of us are in the position where we try to support people who survived all of this horrible things, I think it would be incredibly important to talk about how some people manage not to lose their minds.
now when I while I was listening to you, I realized that I suppressed the most horrible memory of mine just because it's so uncomfortable. But I'm going to tell you that when I was in a summer camp, there was a practice there. All the pioneer was a pioneer summer camp. There were no other summer camps. And all the pioneers would play a game. They would wake up Jewish children and would take them to the woods, and they would play a Gestapo. I don't want to go into the details, but they made Jewish girls watch what they were doing to the boys. I probably remembered this now also because I was thinking about immigration and about what happened when people were eventually allowed to leave the former Soviet Union, and they were waiting for entry visas to the United States in Italy. And a strange phenomenon occurred that people who came from the places where there was rampant anti-Semitism, where they had to come back from the war and work together with the Polizei, with the Nazi collaborationists, because there was no persecution of Nazi collaborationists. Those who fought in the war and came back to find that all their family members were killed because of a neighbor informed the Nazis of their hiding place. All those people and their children who had been subjecting to horrible anti-Semitism in the Ukraine and Belarus couldn't talk about those experiences. And it was essential because otherwise they couldn't get a refugee status. And they kept saying they had to pass an interview in Italy with some representatives from the United States, and they couldn't say a word. They were just mumbling something. Actually, it resulted in a lot of people being stranded in Italy. There was even starvation there because nobody knew what to do with them until Congress actually changed the rules of the admission of the Soviet Jews. But that's what trauma does to people. It also turned out that a lot of people who had been severely traumatized lost kind of capacity to learn. And I think that this is one of the abilities that's so necessary for one to survive. To survive the horrors of anything is to be able to keep one's own mind open, to be able to question, to be able to resist internally. But a lot of people who had been living in very hostile environment lost that ability. They turned into kind of zombies. And when they started arriving here, I'd worked in Jewish Border Family and Children Services and Russian Adolescent Project, and I found that there were so many children who needed help, not even dealing with their trauma, they needed help dealing with their learning disabilities, first and foremost. They were blocked in very many different ways. They couldn't write, they couldn't read, they couldn't listen. It was quite horrific. So the reason I'm talking about it now is that I think that what helped Jews to resist is that since they were Jews of silence, as Elie Wiesel called them so aptly, they resisted silently. They focused on learning and on education and on teaching their children. A lot of people taught their children to learn. A lot of people emphasized how important it was to study, and it happened all over the country. And I think that eventually allowed us to survive. After the denunciation of the call of Stalin, a period that started was called the thaw. There appeared some foreigners who came to Moscow and to big cities. They brought books. There appeared some Jews who brought books on Jewish culture, on history, on Judaism. Rabbis started traveling to Moscow eventually. I do not know what would have happened had we not received help from the West, and had we not been supported by protesters marching all over the world and demanding to free Soviet Jews. And I want to take the opportunity here today to thank those who marched or those whose relatives marched to help us. It not only finally released us, but it also helped to survive, because we knew that we weren't alone. And that was essential, to know that you're not alone. It's a known phenomenon. When people are incarcerated, they start reaching out to each other. They're using different codes to knock on the walls to find out who else is there. We appreciated those knocks on the walls, those books that were brought in, and we finding out that people cared meant a lot and mobilized people. And then a process started that couldn't be stopped. People started getting in groups, learning Hebrew. Several of my Hebrew teachers were incarcerated and spent time in Gulag, but people persevered. People started going to synagogues, finding out what they could learn there. And this is how resistance started. We translated books and typed them on a typewriter with copy paper and distributed them. That was against the law. That was a criminal offense. We organized summer camps, of course, underground summer camps for children, where we stayed there with them in, let's say, in a house in a country, and different teachers would come that would teach them Hebrew, they would teach them history, they would teach them Talmud, whatnot. Every time when we heard a car pass by, I remember I worked as a counselor in such a camp. I remember I froze because I knew that indoctrinating children in religion was a criminal offense. I think it was 7 years in prison. I may be wrong. Maybe more. But nevertheless, people persevered and helped each other. So I can actually go on. I don't know whether we have many questions left. I'm a little bit concerned about the time.
Thank you so much. It's just the picture that and that you described, and the environment in which you had to survive is just it's chilling, and it takes so much to absorb and imagine, one being able to cope with that. And as you know, our series is we're trying to learn from different cultures and see comparisons, what we can learn about racism and discrimination. Also applying to our own situation in the US. And one of the questions, we've a few on this theme of how do you feel anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union related to the current racial tensions in the US today? And how can former immigrants of the Soviet Union use their stories of being persecuted as Jews there to help African Americans who are experiencing racism today?
Well, I think that first and foremost, there should be an appreciation of trauma and what it does to one's own self-esteem, to one's ability to actually how it affects goal making, how it affects the whole life. But the situation here is in somewhat very different. In the former Soviet Union, one couldn't go to court and demand that certain things needed to be corrected. My uncle was sanctioned by the party committee of his college when he peed in a college bathroom, and a cleaning lady walked in. He asked her to leave, and she yelled at him that he was a dirty kike. And he was actually sanctioned, and they put a note into his personal file saying that he caused an anti-Semitic accident to happen. This is not the case in the United States. We have a legal system. There are many things that we can demand, but I think that it's essential for the leaders of the African American community to make plans and really demand what's needed for the community. From my point of view, children, their education, help with learning disability, help with single motherhood, parenthood is essential. And it's a long-term project, but it's just long overdue. It's so needed. And it's not simply funding, it's professionals, and they should be helped by the professionals who will understand the culture. Such professionals need training. So I can talk about it for a long time because actually I've been thinking a lot about it and comparing, it in a strange way. It happened so that I sued somebody for anti-Semitism in the United States. I sued a campground that wouldn't let me in, that would try to first make it difficult to enter, even though the campground was half empty, and then would tell me point blank, this is a Gentile camp, you're not wanted here. And I sued them. And my lawyer in the State Division of Human Rights was an African American who actually had known Dr. King, who told me, oh, I know from your story what happened with you. I resonate on so many counts. And I developed, I can't say a friendship, but we understood each other. And he told me about his fight for human rights in the 60s. But I think that something happened and wasn't attended to. It's like people fought for freedom. People achieved certain rights, but then we need more. We need to do more, not to stop. Resistance should continue, and not only in protests. There should be some constructive action in helping communities.
We have another question about understanding and conceptualizing racism through an interpersonal psychoanalytic lens. And in terms of therapy, what would you say is crucial for therapists to understand when treating racial trauma? Is it different than other kinds of trauma? Or there's something specific?
Well, it's a great question, not so easy to answer, because I always tend to think about a particular individual. But I think that it has to do with one has to be incredibly sensitive to the issue of otherness. When I started talking about the anti-Semitism and Stalin terror, I was also saying that they were trying to do away with difference, so that the other was an ultimate enemy. But I think that when we're dealing with racial trauma, we have to first and foremost deal with otherness within ourselves. We have to, because otherwise it becomes really condescending in treatment. I think that only through finding this other in myself and resonating, hopefully, with what a person experiences, one can help another person. I actually had a very interesting and fruitful experience working with anti-Semites who wanted to deal with their anti-Semitism, but they had to discover it in the process of treatment. They were practicing Russian Orthodox people, in many ways remarkable personalities, and they discovered their anti-Semitism during the course of treatment. And only through being very honest and recognizing my limitations because of my previous experience and traumas, my own traumas, I was able to help those people. I think that it all goes through creating a relationship that is not afraid of hostility, of admitting mutual grudges, maybe, and seeing how one, as I already said, how one deals with otherness in oneself. Only then one can deal with somebody else. And it could all happen simultaneously at many times. Mm-hmm. And it should also, there will be a lot of failures. It can happen otherwise.
Do you have some suggestions or ideas? You mentioned when we're talking about anti-Semitic tendencies, anti-Semitism is rising in the US now. Do you have any suggestions or ideas about what can help combat this rising anti-Semitism in the US?
I think that the Soviet Union experiment teaches us many things. One is that there is a need for, one should study history. Whenever we forget history, we repeat it. It's the same thing on a personal level, but it's the same on a societal level. And when history is edited, the way it was edited and re-edited in the former Soviet Union, people turn into zombies, and they could be manipulated, and the aggression could be channeled wherever those who are in power will channel it. So I think that the more we teach and allow expression of different opinions, the more there are forums where people can argue with respect and yet express different opinions. The more we encourage questions over the kind of indoctrinating people, I think the more people will be able to think. I think that it seems to me that what happens is that people lose ability to think, and then they turn to bias. And they could hate Jews, they could hate African Americans, they could hate, I don't know, there is this joke about those who, cyclists. It all happens when people stop thinking. But the ability to think has to be developed. And when facts are obfuscated, or when there is fear that something that will be said will be wrong, that it will be against a certain point of view or even ideology, this is a dangerous path. And I see it happening oftentimes, that people would rather stick to ideologies than to a free search for truth, which could be uncomfortable.
We have another question here, sort of dealing with our current, recent political situation, that we've heard that many Russians in the US voted for Trump. Any idea, well, I don't know if you would know if this is true, but if it were true, any idea what would be behind it?
Well, I can say many things. Well, one of the things that comes to mind is that and that's probably true not only for Russian immigrants, that's probably true for a lot of Americans that voted for Trump, that Trump symbolized kind of a certain kind of power that was not respectful of a sociopathic power, that was not respectful of many things. I mean, I don't have to give examples. Everyone knows. And that could be appealing. It seemed that kind of he is like everyone else. For many people, it seemed that way. His Loka talk, well, he talks about women the way I do, right? Mm-hmm. For Russian immigrants specifically, though, I know some very intelligent Russian immigrants who voted for Trump for economic reasons, and I don't know and understand the economy well enough to really argue there. But they had their serious reasons, and they knew who Trump was, and they felt that nevertheless that's what the United States needed at the moment. But I think there's always an appeal for a strong leader who is also kind of macho, for another Stalin, kind of. I mean, if you see how many Russian citizens are now voting to rehabilitate Stalin, to kind of force Stalin. How many Georgians? I mean, Stalin came from Georgia, from Soviet Georgia, and he killed so many Georgians. But how many Georgians still worship Stalin? He's supposedly a strong leader, like any sociopath, is very appealing to people. Being an immigrant, one has to deal with a lot of difficulties, with the personal disempowerment. Immigration in many ways is learning about the things that a 5-year-old knows. And it's humiliating. And here is this man who is going to make America great again. And there is probably another side, and it's connected with anti-Semitism. I mean, whenever there is a trauma, a racial trauma, an anti-Semitism, or there is also a trauma, there is a victim and there is a perpetrator. And actually, whatever happens is traumatic for both sides. We do not talk enough about perpetrators, but they have to live with that, and it's not easy, and it's also being passed on to children. So at one point, when one is, that there may be an exchange of roles. It's not exactly what they call a Stockholm Syndrome, but there is this wish that I was on top and you were down. And it happens. It happens to some people, some fellow countrymen that I know, who, when they immigrated, turned into a kind of prototypical Russian abuser. Because they started feeling that they have the power. It happened because of tremendous angst that they had lived with, and total emptiness inside, and devastation. But in many ways, I think that Trump should appeal to such people. But there were many other reasons. I mean, I really feel uncomfortable kind of putting everyone in the Russian immigrant community into one group. There are many different groups and there are many different reasons. There were a Russian immigrant community is very committed to Israel. And there was this feeling that Trump would support Israel. Besides, whatever is said about Russian communities supporting Trump, it's only true for those who are older. Russian yuppies, and there are many were not for Trump. And there were tremendous, horrible problems in families that I heard of and witnessed, where people wouldn't talk to each other and would not, I mean, I personally had guests at my table where I had to request that we are not talking politics today. This is a celebration, because people would literally feel like cutting their throats. We're very passionate about it, and for good reasons. I mean, I think there is a lesson in what we went through, and we need to understand that there were good reasons that attracted people to Trump, because they couldn't find those good reasons kind of fulfilled otherwise.
We have another comment question here. My grandmother, an ardent socialist, was Russian and Jewish. She spoke Yiddish, Russian, and English. She came to America as a young woman in the 1920s to escape persecution. When I subsequently had the opportunity to visit Moscow and St. Petersburg to teach psychoanalysis, I was struck by many cultural aspects, such as mannerisms and culinary qualities that were familiar to me through my relationship with my grandmother. My trip revealed to me more than before that she was Jewish, but she was clearly Russian too. My question has to do with the manner of being both inside and outside of a persecutory, oppressive culture. Can you comment on what it's like to be both part of a culture and persecuted by it? This manner, it seems, has parallels for African American people in America and for persecuted people everywhere. How much of the culture within which one is embedded can one claim as one's own under the conditions of discrimination and persecution?
This is such a great question. A lot could be said about it. I struggled with it personally. I must have, this is a personal disclosure. I love Russia. I am very sorry for what Russian people have been going through for decades and maybe centuries. But there are many, I've always felt very connected with Russia. I love Russian literature, Russian art. I think that Russian culture actually did a lot, gave a lot to the world. And when I was contemplating immigrating, I felt guilty that I was leaving the country that in many ways where I didn't feel welcome. but I felt that I owed something to it. So this is my answer. This is my answer. I don't know what else to say. It's a struggle. It is difficult. You can love and hate. I think I loved one sort of people and hated another sort of people. But sometimes it probably got together. I remember a very dear friend of mine, an architect and well-educated woman, who after we already known each other for years, told me, Masha, I love you dearly, but could you please tell me, why do you Jews put Christian blood into matzah? I didn't know what to answer. I am still traumatized by what had happened then. I tried to explain, but I felt she didn't believe me. But nevertheless, there are many things about Russia and yes, and Russian culinary experiences, by all means, that I cherish and that are very dear to my heart and that I miss.
Well, thank you so much. This you've opened our eyes, and we can feel the experience that you suffered through your talk, and we really appreciate your sharing that with us today and being so open. It has had a big impact. And I also want you to know that many in our audience are not clinicians. They're from other disciplines. So you're reaching not only people in our profession, but also outside. So we really thank you for that. And want to thank both you, Masha and Max, for the talk today. Also want to thank our audience for joining us today. This event will be recorded, and if you missed any of our previous events, they're on the Institute's YouTube channel, and this one will join that one as well. So you can tell your friends if they were not able to join us today that they can see this in the future. We also hope that you'll join us on Saturday, May 22nd, when our guest will be Dr. Juan Mezich, who will be speaking about Peru and possibly Latin America. Our moderator will be Dr. Vlad Novak. So we hope to see you again as we continue our series on confronting racism, discrimination, and othering perspectives from around the world. And hope you will all be safe and stay well. And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
And thank you finally for having given me the opportunity to speak about anti-Semitism in public. I wish my grandmother heard me.
Thank you.